All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on winning the Affluent U.S. Traveler. My name is Chris Fair. I'm the President of Resonance, joining today from Vancouver. And joining me today is our Managing Director, Dan Culic. Dan?
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here as well and talking to you today with Chris, especially after spending time at TIAC last week in Ottawa, meeting a lot of different people and hearing about uh, the excitement around Canada, especially hearing from DC, Destination Canada in that space. It feels perfectly timed for us to be talking to you about this today as well. So I'm going to let Chris kick things off, and we've got a lot to share with you today.
All right, thanks, Dan. And just as a reminder, if you have questions, we'll get into some Q&A discussion at the end. You can hit the Q&A in the Zoom panel at the bottom there, pop your questions in there, and we'll get to those towards the end. As Dan said, there's a lot to be excited about as it relates to tourism in Canada, which is really where we're going to be focusing on today. Of course, it is American Thanksgiving today, so we are obviously many people on holidays. Yesterday was, the biggest travel day of the year in the United States. Of course, here in Canada, where we are joining from today, we're all in the office, and we thought this would be a good moment to really take a deep dive and give you a bit of a sneak peek into the work that we've been doing on studying affluent U.S. travel. Just as a bit of background first, on Resonance, we're focused on creating strategies, brands, and campaigns that attract residents, visitors, and investment to places around the world. Our focus is on place branding and marketing through the research like this that we do, both just studying destinations and also particular consumer groups. And I'll talk about in a moment why the affluent U.S. traveler is so important to destinations, hotels, and resorts around the world. We do work on placemaking strategies, tourism master plans, destination plans for destinations across Canada, around the world. And we work extensively, particularly with destinations, hotels, and resorts on branding and looking at how to position them, not just from a marketing perspective, but also how do we create experiences that will resonate with the types of travelers they're seeking to attract. And lastly, we do ongoing marketing as it relates to creating campaign content to attract travelers, residents, or companies to different places. These are just some of the places that we've worked with, working extensively across Canada, from our work with Destination Canada on the 2030 strategy to working with destinations like Vancouver, to Toronto, where we're doing a destination master plan, to working on with Discover Saskatoon, and actually also working with private sector developers in Saskatoon on the repositioning and rebranding of the historic Bessborough Hotel, to working in the Atlantic Canada with Envision St. John. So we're really happy to think about tourism across Canada from a Canadian perspective today and bring some of our global experience and our extensive experience across the U.S. and share that with you. For background on this particular study that we'll be talking about today is based on our work going back to 2008, where we've been studying the travel aspirations and intentions of the top 10% and top 1% of U.S. households. And we'll explain in a moment what the definition of those households is. For this study this year, we ran this with Leger between August 13th and September 7th. We have a segment of general population U.S. travelers, so looking at Gen Pop sample in the US. Then we have our top 10%, and then we have our segment of the top 1%. And we'll really be focusing mostly on the top 10% today. So I'm going to quickly give you a little bit of an overview. We're all pretty familiar with the US travel market, and we'll talk just a little bit in aggregate what that is. Then Dan will do a little bit of a deeper dive into understanding the purchasing power of affluent travelers. From there, really what we're going to spend most of our time today is understanding what we call the millionaire mindsets, looking at the segmentation that we've built. Of course, there's different segmentation models out there. Ours is specifically built around the segmentation of affluent U.S. travelers, and we'll share those different 5 mindsets. And really the goal here is to help you understand as you think about your marketing strategy, positioning, destination development, what is your target audience, and providing a bit of a frame and focus that we can't be everything to everyone. How do we become focused on specific segments and mindsets of travelers? From there, Dan will share a little bit just on our data collecting on how these travelers, regardless of what segment they fall into, are booking travel today. And then we'll talk a little bit about channel strategy in terms of some of the best in class examples of how people are reaching affluent travelers and the appropriate channels. And then we'll dive into the Q&A. So let's get into it. First, just as I said, a bit of an overview of the U.S. travel market, and I think this is well understood that the U.S. market is the second largest outbound market from both a visitor perspective and from a dollar volume perspective. So China is number one, U.S. follows number two, and we've seen really historic growth. Of course, we had the pandemic and outbound travel plummeted, started to recover in 2022, and it recovered quite quickly actually. When you look at where we were in 2019, the outbound market from the US was just under 140 billion. In 2023, now it's up 215 billion, and that's 33% growth just over 2022. And as we have the 2024 numbers, expect that number will be over 250 billion. So we're looking at a market that has really actually almost doubled in size in terms of its dollar value since 2019. One of the things that we've asked and focused on is just, well, where do these travelers want to go? And we've been tracking this going back to 2008. And you can see that when we look at just the US market in general, this is for Gen Pop, around a third of those travelers travel in the North America, then Caribbean is second, followed by Europe. And North America includes Canada, US, and Mexico in there. And then you really see smaller distribution across the board. And then we have, one third of our Gen Pop sample that say they're not planning to travel at all. In terms of where they want to go, interesting, we ask kind of two questions. One, what is a destination you visited in the past that's one of your favorites? And also, what destinations are you planning to visit in the next 12 to 24 months? And you can see that Canada and Mexico really kind of tied there from past visitation favorites. And they're also tied at 16% for where they want to go in the future. And then followed by England, Italy, France, Germany. Interesting to see the rise of Costa Rica. And then U.S. Virgin Islands is one of the most popular destinations that American travelers in general have visited in the Caribbean. Canada, as I said, is the top choice, and that's kind of really where we're going to focus in a lot of our conversation today is really focused on which segments are most interested in Canada, what's important to them, what types of vacations they're taking. If you're from another country joining us today, from the Caribbean, et cetera, we do have other additional data and happy to speak to that with you after this webinar. We also thought it was interesting to share as part of our World's Best Cities and reports, we conduct a global survey of Ipsos. We run that in 30 countries. And in the US, these are the cities they told us they most want to visit over the next 12 to 24 months. Interesting to see that Toronto is actually one of the top 10 urban destinations that American travelers in general are planning to travel to, really just below Miami and Seattle there, and equivalent to Austin, Dallas, Denver. You go a little bit just further down the list, Vancouver is not far behind there. So I think that's interesting to see that we often think about Canada as a destination, but when we think about our provinces, but when we get down to actually the urban level, we see that Toronto and Vancouver are actually quite competitive in our top 10 urban destinations from an American context. So with that, I'll let Dan talk just a little bit about, as we focus in on the affluent travelers, who they are and why they're important.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So before we jump into the different segments that Chris mentioned before, we thought we'd take a higher level view of who the affluent travelers are, starting first with kind of the concentration of wealth. We've been seeing a lot of the stats in the media recently, and since the pandemic, wealth ownership and spending power has never been higher and concentrated in fewer hands. Globally, we're seeing three-quarters of all wealth is now held by the top 10%, and about 50% is actually held within the top 1% of high net worth individuals. When we look at their purchasing power, that's where it gets even more interesting. So the wealthiest 10% of Americans went from having about 36% of consumer spending in the 90s all the way up to over 50% last year. They continue to drive the majority of consumer spending and are the primary engine driving growth in both tourism expenditure, which is what we're here to talk about, as well as the consumption of luxury goods. Now, let's actually dig into the details of the money. So we've broken it down for the top 10% as well as that top 1% to really see the difference between the two. So from an income standpoint, your top 10% tends to be in that 240 to 60K range, with the top 1% making over 600,000 or more each year. Their net worth is over 13 million if you're in the 1%. And it's interesting to see the breakdown of how many US households fit within the 10% and 1%. We've got about 13, just above 13 million in the 10% and about 1.32 million in that top 1%. So quite a few households are fitting into these demographics these days. So when we think about how they travel, when we dug into the details since the pandemic, the top 1% has continued to travel more. They were taking about 5 trips back in 2022. They're up to 6 this year. The top 10% was around 3.5 back in 2022, and they're taking at least 4 trips, sometimes more this year. We're always going to include the general population number as well, just so we can see that comparison to your average American and the number of trips they might be taking and kind of validate that. They're only about half or even less than what the 1% is doing. So as we look at where they're likely to travel, and Chris has started to touch on this, they're likely to travel internationally. 53% of the top 10% and 66% of the top 1% are intending to travel internationally next year. So that bodes incredibly well for Canada as well as other parts of the world. And we think about how much they're spending. This is the number that was probably one of the most interesting as Chris and I were digging into the details. Their average trip spend has increased significantly, even from 2022. 3 years ago, they were spending around $8,000 on a trip if they were in the top 1%. That's north of $12,000 per trip now this past year. Top 10% was closer to 5,000, edging over closer to 8,000 trips this year. So when we take that into account, we think about their intention to travel internationally, the number of trips they're taking, the amount of money that they're spending on travel each year, it actually ends up being a pretty staggering number. We're seeing the potential of $544 billion being spent on travel, with a significant portion of that amount of money happening outside of the United States. And we could look at the details differently to try and figure out how much is coming to Canada, but we are anticipating that a large portion of that will be spent on Canada based on the percentage split of the interest of them wanting to come here and their intention to travel internationally next year. So with that as more of a high-level snapshot, we're going to dig into those mindsets that Chris mentioned earlier, and I'm going to hand it back to him to walk you through that.
Thanks, Dan. So you have this, marketplace, and of course, I think we all know that it's common sense that affluent travelers would travel more and spend more. I think the significant growth is not well appreciated when you look at those numbers that we're seeing in terms of the growth in consumer spending. And this really reflects, what you're seeing in the media in the U.S., well, and in Canada to some degree as well, around what's called a K-shaped economy, where you have part of the economy in a segment of consumer spending that is doing well, and another part that is not doing as well, as we get into the mid-level and economy segment. And we didn't share all of that data with you today, but if you go into CoStar and you look at which segments of the accommodation sector have seen growth, it's all in the upscale and luxury segment. And in fact, we in the mid-scale and economy segment, revenue growth has been in decline. And the latest forecast for tourism economics in the U.S. and in Europe, and we'll see in Canada. Obviously, we had some good support in Canada through increased domestic travel over the last year that helped all of our segments. But longer term, we would expect to see that most of the growth is in the luxury and upscale segment. So as we want to target and think about that great affluent travelers, purchasing power, spending, there's millions of them, but we can't think about them all as being one and the same. And that's really where we want to get into the 5 millionaire mindsets. And our segmentation modeling is really built on 2 dimensions. One is understanding why travelers vacation in the first place. Some travelers are looking for relaxation. Others are looking for adventure and to get out of their comfort zone. So there's various reasons, why we take leisure vacations. And then the second dimension that we look at is what activities do they participate in while they are on vacation? And that helps us really define 5 different mindsets that we'll talk through today. And I think as we go through these, think about, which mindset is appropriate for your destination, your hotel or resort, and how that might influence as you think about service delivery, experience development, and your marketing positioning and delivery. So first, we'll talk about what we call the experience enthusiasts. They're the largest segment. We'll talk about cultural explorers, comfort seekers, outdoor traditionalists, and habitual loyalists. And I'm also going to highlight, which ones of these for today's webinar are most interested in visiting and planning to visit Canada. So when we look at the Gen Pop sample in the US, these are how those mindsets are divided. You see that the experience enthusiasts are the largest segment, roughly 1/3. And I think this is, common as we think about travel. It's all about experiences. This is really our sort of mindset as we think about travelers in general. But it's important to think about that there's these other 4 mindsets as well. We have our cultural explorers. I'll talk about those in a moment, around 18%. Outdoor traditionalists at 19%. Then we have our comfort seekers at 18%, and the habitual loyalists are the smallest group at 13%. Now, when you apply that same segmentation algorithm and methodology to the top 10%, you get slightly different results. You see that the experience enthusiasts still represent around 1/3. Our outdoor traditionalists drop a little bit, and you see a massive growth in the cultural explorers. And then you see similar smaller segments of the comfort seekers and much smaller number of habitual loyalists. So as we think about the American affluent traveler, we think about the top 2 audiences being these experience enthusiasts. On one hand, 1/3, the cultural explorers is the other third, and then the other 3 segments make up our last third. So let's walk through each of these and try and understand a little bit about them. First, with how do we think about where they're interested in traveling to and what are some of the regional differences? And you can see that for Canada, that the experience enthusiasts, cultural explorers, and outdoor traditionalists are the top 3 segments that are interested in or in planning to visit Canada in the next 12 to 24 months, and less significant for the comfort seekers and the habitual loyalists. Interestingly, the breakdown looks fairly similar for Mexico, but you start to get, very different results if you're, let's say, in France, that doesn't appeal as much to the outdoor traditionalists. Same thing with Germany, etc. So there are different audience breakdowns depending on the destination. So let's start with the experience enthusiasts. As I mentioned, I think these are kind of what we think about as the ideal traveler. They're the youngest segment, 52 years old, which for many of you that joining us might think that's not that young, but I think it's important to note as you think about the top 10%, top 1%, they tend to skew older in the 50 plus category. A function of generating wealth is age in terms of net worth. But this segment is a bit younger amongst the top 10% overall. They skew more male, they have higher incomes, net worth, and they spend more while they're on vacation. And this segment actually makes up half of the top 1%. So the more affluent you are, the more you fall into this particular segment. They're really, as we think about them, they're the active adventurers, explorers, whether that's beaches, cities, they participate in outdoor sports, they're interested in health and wellness. They're really interested in everything. And as you saw on that table earlier, this is where 39% of our affluent experience enthusiasts in the top 10% say they're planning to visit Canada in the next 12 to 24 months. So this is really 4 out of the 10 travelers, if you're a Canadian destination, that would be coming. So what types of vacations are they interested in? You're going to see VFR, visit friends and relatives, is at the top of the list, followed by beach resorts. That's pretty common. They're very strong as it relates to the cruise market, also visiting cities. They're the most likely to combine business with leisure. You'll see that most of the other segments, as we think about this concept of leisure, that's not actually something that most segments participate in, but it's something that's quite prevalent here with our experience enthusiasts, as is health and wellness. And they're also the segment that's most interested in mountain resorts. And because they combine business with leisure, they're also the segment that says they work remotely while on vacation. terms of their criteria when choosing a vacation destination, you're going to see safety here is at the top of the list, and that's true for almost all of the segments. So as you think about the American traveler, why does Canada resonate? Or some European destinations, safety is of preeminent importance for the international American traveler. Value for money, not surprised that that comes in here, but then you see a real plurality of different factors, whether that's quality of the accommodation, friendliness of locals, exciting city environment, the weather. Interestingly, the positive experiences in the past that as you look at the affluent traveler more so than the Gen Pop, actually, they like to return to places that they've had experiences with in the past. They're traveling more frequently, taking more trips. So they have that repeat visitation. So the opportunity here, if we think about how do you develop loyalty with these travelers, because they will come back and visit the same places again and again. They're also interested in cultural attractions and fun attractions. So these are just at the top of the list. When we look at and you try and think about, well, what makes this segment different than others is really based on the activities they participate in. And the ones highlighted here that are lighter in color are the ones that they over-index in versus the top 10% in average. So they actually over-index in on fine dining and culinary experiences. Their interest in learning new things, fun attractions is about the same as the top 10% in average. They significantly over-index for health and wellness. And this is really, really important that we also see that while we talk about wellness, well-being as a major trend within travel and tourism, it isn't an activity that resonates with all types of travelers. There are very specific segments that you need to target if you have a health and wellness proposition. They over-index for cultural events, and not surprisingly, they over-index significantly for outdoor sports. So as we mentioned, these are the active experiences. They participate in outdoor sports more than any other segment. They also visit mountain resorts more than any other segment. So for a lot of outdoors oriented destinations, this would really be the number one segment to be targeting. The next is our cultural explorers. So they're slightly older. They skew slightly more female, and they have the highest average spend on vacations in terms of their expenditure. It's about the same. It's roughly, one third of the top 10% and just slightly less, roughly the same for the top 1%. So there's not a significant difference in this segment like we saw with the experience enthusiasts skewing much higher for the top 1%. So in fact, if you're looking at the top 1%, the experience enthusiasts and the cultural explorers, just those two segments account for 80% of the top 1%. So when we think about cultural explorers, they like learning, cultural attractions, authentic local experiences. Of course, in all destinations, we're talking a lot about authenticity, community events. What are those local experiences that are authentic and true to the destination? That they resonate most with these cultural explorers. They really want to immerse themselves in culture, traditions, and they're willing to get a little bit out of their comfort zone to do that. And here, as we saw earlier, 26% of the affluent cultural explorers in the U.S. are planning to visit Canada in the next 12 to 24 months. So in terms of the types of vacations, again, pretty similar here to the experience enthusiasts in terms of a little bit higher as it relates to VFR, similar, a little bit higher for visiting cities, a little bit lower on beach resorts, still quite strong on cruise so as a segment. Mountain resorts is a little bit less at 22%. And then you can see here quite a significant drop off as it relates to business trip with leisure. And as I mentioned, taking vacations for health and wellness is not as important to this particular segment, which interestingly, as you get older travelers, you find in our research that they're less and less interested in health and wellness, and health and wellness seems to resonate with the younger travelers within each of these particular segments. So their criteria, again, safety, value, but you also see scenery and nature. Friendly is quite high here, friendliness of locals. English being spoken is more important to this particular segment. Quality of accommodation is important, but a little bit less. And then we have learning something new, weather, and iconic landmarks. So again, as you try and think about, well, how do I understand this particular segment? Well, these are the things actually all on the right in this particular graph where they skew higher for in terms of participation. So very high with engaging with nature and learning new things. And I think this is what's kind of interesting when we think about cultural travelers. We often think about them as being focused on cultural institutions, cities, etc. That's true, but they're also equally interested in engaging with nature. But the way they engage with nature is different than the experience enthusiasts. This is much more passive versus active. So as we think about experience development within destinations or programming within hotels and resorts, really important to think about nature as not just being active, but how do we create more passive, observational, immersive experiences that this significant segment can access. I think the cultural aspect, the dining here goes without saying. And then you can see they're still interested in health and wellness as an activity. It's just not the type of vacation. They're not driving or choosing destinations based on that. It's an activity that they participate in as part of these other trips that they're motivated on based on culture and nature. Our third segment, now we're getting into some of the smaller ones, are the comfort seekers. They're a little older, they travel and spend less, they're somewhat less adventurous. They represent 16% of the top 1%, 12% of the top 1%. I do think that this particular segment is something that we kind of often think about when we think about the luxury traveler, that they want to stay in a luxury hotel, they want to be pampered, they want service. The comfort seekers are that customer, but much smaller segment or make up a much smaller portion of the affluent traveler than I think we understand. They're about 15% of them are planning to visit Canada in the next 12 to 24 months. So this is a smaller segment. When you look at them visiting cities, beach, cruise, again, similar. Those are the top three for the previous two segments as well. Top four if you include VFR. And then everything else really drops off. So this traveler is not that interested in trips to mountain resorts. They're not that interested in combining business trips with leisure. They're not that interested in taking vacations specifically for health and wellness. So we can kind of look at them as focused on cruise, beach, and city vacations. Again, safety of preeminent importance. You can see that up to 80% here. Value followed by value for money. Friendliness of locals. And you start to see that as an important theme throughout all of the different segments. But as you get down here, you see things like authentic local experiences is important to this particular segment. And again, positive experiences in the past. And this is the only segment where privacy and exclusivity comes into the top 10. And that's why I sort of characterize them as how we imagine the luxury or the affluent traveler in our imagination is focused on somebody that wants to be in a luxury resort, having that privacy exclusivity. You actually don't see privacy and exclusivity ranked that high. It's not in the top 10 for any of the other segments. So that, as we think about what's important in the mindset of the affluent traveler, is not so much the Four Seasons, Ritz-Carlton, popular conception of what a luxury destination looks like. You can see friendliness of locals, authentic local experiences are actually much more important to all of the segments than privacy and exclusivity. In terms of their activities, what they skew higher in is learning new things. They are interested in culture, but they're different from the cultural explorers in that they're not willing to get out of their comfort zone. So they like cultural attractions. They'll go to cultural events. They like to eat out in restaurants. They like sightseeing tours. So this traveler likes things organized for them, as opposed to the cultural explorers that are more independent and willing to explore. So this fourth segment is a small one of the top 1%. It's only 3% of the top 1%. It's 13% though of the top 10%. They're much more practical, cost conscious. They're older, skew more female. They have lower incomes and net worth in their relative to the others within the top 10%. And they spend a bit less on vacations. And they're really looking for outdoor activities. They prioritize scenery, climate, and value over high-end experiences. And it's interesting, while this segment is smaller, only 13%, significantly, almost a quarter of them plan to visit Canada in the next 12 to 24 months. And you can see here that they are more interested in mountain resorts. So yes, beach, city, cruise, just like the others at the top of the list, but they bump up here for mountain resorts at 22%. And again, they're looking at scenery and nature. So that safety value for money is pretty much table stakes across the segments. And then you get beneath that and you see, well, what motivates them? scenery and nature, so it wouldn't be surprising that Canada is one of the top segments for them. Of course, then you also see outdoor activities further down the list, authentic local experiences, and then we have the U.S. currency, climate, quality accommodations, English spoken. That's similar drivers for many of the different segments. So this outdoor activities, scenery and nature are really the things that are important to them. And that's why you see the activities that they participate in. What do they skew in much higher than average for the top 10%? It's engaging with nature at number one. Then you can see outdoor sports is highlighted here as something that they skew much higher in than average. Interesting also that they're interested in live sports is something that at 53%. So our last segment, and then we'll start to dive into how we reach and how they book and how we reach these travelers is the habitual loyalists. This is a relatively small segment, much larger amongst Gen Pop travelers. As you get more affluent, you'll find less of these. They're very traditional, routine oriented. They're the oldest segment. They have the lowest income, the lower net worth and spend within their cohorts. They're only 4% of the top 1%, 6% of the top 10%. So we won't spend a lot of time on these, but just to understand there is this traveler that I kind of think about, hey, my grandfather and my father are this kind of traveler, right? That they like familiarity, that go to the same places, they want it to be easy. They're not so much interested in novelty, excitement, discovery, or sustainability for that matter. 7% of these travelers are planning to visit on Canada in the next 12 to 24 months. And they skew lower in terms of the types of vacations. But again, you see beach, city, and cruise much lower there. So really, they're focused on primarily visiting friends and relatives, taking a beach vacation, maybe visiting a city, and then the rest of these types of vacations really falls off for this type of traveler. I think what's also interesting as you think about the mindset for this one is that, yes, safety is at the top of the list, but actually even more so than value is U.S. currency accepted, English being spoken. So as they think about traveling internationally, they're really conservative in terms of wanting to be in a place that largely feels similar to where the place that they've come from. You also see passport not required down the list, which is difficult to travel internationally. So probably why we see fewer of these travelers traveling outside the U.S. In terms of their activities, they don't skew higher for anything, so their actual participation in most activities is lower than average across the board. So that's a lot of information to digest, but hopefully it's kind of a takeaway. Think about, we have these five different segments now, five different mindsets that appeal to different types of experiences, different types of destinations. And hopefully, as we get into thinking about your marketing strategy, positioning, adopting a segmentation and a psychographic approach, rather than focusing just on demographics, really helps you refine your messaging, your positioning, and experience development in your destination, hotel, or resort. So with that, let's talk about how they're booking. I'll give it over back to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm actually really excited to dig into some of these details now. Chris did such a fantastic job of walking through those five mindsets. So from there, where do we go? Well, let's look at first, where are they actually going to book travel? We're going to start with the top 10%. Shouldn't come as much surprise, but their go-to, the vast majority of them, almost 70%, are going straight to hotels, resorts, airline sites directly. They're looking at the different offers and opportunities that are available to them with some of the favorite brands on the luxury side in mind. Over 50% of them, actually 56%, are going to online travel websites, those OTAs that are really helping to support the travel industry. And about a quarter of them are still turning to travel agents, talking to the different brands, calling airlines directly over the phone. Credit card travel portals are critical. There's a lot of the high net worth individuals who are parts of loyalty programs and are able to redeem based on different status tiers. But one thing that we want to call out is about a fifth of the top 10% are turning to the tourism destination website. So it's a very important tool for them in discovering what's available in Canada, down to the region, down to the province, down to the city, down to those small centers. So keeping the information on our destination sites across Canada updated and fresh is critical. And as we get a little bit more niche into the top 10 or top 1%, sorry, those numbers go even higher. Almost 30% are going to tourism destination websites. More of them are going to credit card travel portals. A lot more are actually still placing phone calls to talk to different brands to actually understand what they're booking and working closely with travel agents. But when it comes to the direct brand and the OTAs, pretty consistent between the 10% and the 1%. So that's some higher level information of where they're actually going to book. And that's kind of setting up our next section nicely as we think about whether you're a business or a DMO or whatever you might exist as within the tourism space. We need to show up where this affluent traveler is, where they're spending their time, where they're going to get inspired for their next trip. And as Chris and I talked about what we wanted to share with you, we've broken this down into 5 areas, starting with probably one of the most critical tools available to us now. Artificial intelligence has truthfully surged over the last, let's call it 2 to 3 years. From what we're seeing in the data, about 30% of the top 10% are using AI, a variety of tools, ChatGPT, Gemini, going to unique travel-based tools like Mindtrip uh, to research and to build itineraries and to really think about where do they want to go on their next trip. And 7% of them are actually booking based on what they're seeing on AI. So it's such a critical tool that just a few years ago, we barely even had on our radar as something that we need to be taking into consideration as we're thinking through our content strategy, as we're thinking through the updates to our site, what we're putting out on social channels, and the information that we're sharing, because the LLMs are pulling information from everywhere. When we think about the affluent traveler and how they're using this, they expect personalization as a baseline now. It's not a bonus. And AI allows us to tailor content, itineraries, and messaging to speak to their exact motivations. AI also gives us really interesting insights that reveal what luxury travelers are searching for, when they're planning, and what factors are essentially driving the conversion to actually book a trip. So we are able to actually use these tools to act with precision. It's taking a lot of the guesswork out of our planning. AI can also help us streamline the customer journey through dynamic trip builders, for example, or real-time recommendations based on things that are recently launching in the market that we actually want to put in front of this group. And there's also really immersive planning tools that for a lot of these travelers are feeling like they're designed specifically for them. When we think about the DMOs, we can also leverage AI alongside the traveler to actually unlock efficiency, make better decisions in what we're putting in front of these travelers, and ultimately elevate the experience for them. So as we think about AI, there's so much information, like I said before, that's getting fed into this that it's actually teed up nicely in relating to the next section that we want to talk to you about, which is earned media. So earned media is a critical part of any marketing strategy these days. It gives credibility and authority to a lot of what we're doing in the destination and travel space. But it also feeds a lot of information right back into the LLMs and the AI tools. 9% of the top 10% are essentially a booking based on what they're seeing in publications. And when Chris and I talked over the last couple of days, we realized, well, maybe that number doesn't seem that high when it comes specifically to publications and articles that people might be reading in Condé Nast or Travel and Leisure. But it all comes back down to that content strategy, that content approach. Every single piece that's getting published out on the internet is now getting pulled into AI. It's getting pulled into search. So the more that we can get different publications talking about what we're doing, the more credibility actually goes into our campaign work or the things that we're putting out in the world. Affluent travelers really trust expert voices. They believe in respected publications, especially when they feature Canada. And it's actually a way for us to elevate paid advertising or elevate our campaigns in a way that paid advertising simply can't do these days. Third-party validation is critical for luxury travelers. They want to feel like they're choosing destinations based on what tastemakers are telling them are either cool in the moment or emerging areas around the world that they should visit. They believe in journalists and what they're putting in front of them. And when we think about earned media, they can really help Canada break through the clutter of all of the noise that's coming at this specific group with rich storytelling that can position Canada, our destination, as premium and globally relevant. So from there, we layer in kind of one of our third critical pieces, which is in the online ratings and peer reviews. As Chris mentioned before, a lot of our mindset across all five have safety as one of the factors that they take into consideration. That's not something that you would incorporate into your messaging. You're never going to run a message in a campaign about safety in Canada, but peer reviews is where some of that information can really show up. When an affluent traveler is booking a high value trip, they're really relying on recommendations and thoughts from their friends, their family, people that they see similar to themselves and can help alleviate the feeling that there might be some risk attached to the trip or validate the quality of some of the accommodations or the experiences that they're looking at. Recent testimonials, strong ratings, absolutely influence booking habits. So this is one of those levers that we believe DMOs can pull to actually help increase conversion as the travelers actually move through the purchase funnel and get closer to booking. You can also look at it on the flip side. Reviews can also unlock potential where we might see gaps in some of the service offerings or even some of the quality of the product that we're offering. So that actually enables us and DMOs across Canada to work with partners to fix some of those issues and hopefully fix it before it even becomes a bigger issue from a reputation standpoint. But the other thing that's really interesting here is as we kind of dug into the details of this particular channel, we also realized there's tools like Reddit that vast majority of people are going to on a regular basis. Chris and I kind of laughed. We're maybe a little bit older, so we're not spending as much time on Reddit as maybe some of the younger audiences. But when we looked at different AI tools like Gemini, we realized that Reddit is actually one of the best sources of where Gemini is pulling information from. So all these different pieces are interconnected when we think about the type of content that we're putting out there, the channels that we're putting out there, where they're reading it, but more importantly, what is also feeding the information that the LLMs are pulling. So fourth section, switching to social media and influencers, super critical piece. This traveler, the top 10%, is spending a ton of time on social. 10% of them are using social for inspiration, and 7% of them are actually turning to celebrities, influencers, content creators for inspiration. These two channels, we've started to combine them a lot in our discussions. Often in a social strategy, influencers are deeply baked into a brand's social content. They're very rarely decoupled these days. And both of them combined are really providing the aspirational side of the early stages when people are just starting to search out where they might go. High-end influencers, content creators, celebrities can really lend cultural currency to our work and the campaigns that we're putting out in the world. But when it comes to a place or a destination, they also can provide authentic endorsement of the space. And for an affluent traveler who already follows and trusts these people, those endorsements ring huge. Influencers can also let us reach niche audiences. Think about culinary adventurers, think about private aviation travelers, think about wellness seekers, all those different pieces that Chris talked about across all five of the mindsets. We can unlock specific niche audiences through content creators who speak to those exact types of activities or moments that people can engage with. So lastly, that kind of tips us into advertising and brand content. Still an incredibly important piece to consider as we think about the overall approach to a marketing strategy for anyone within the tourism space or a DMO. Advertising can keep Canada in constant view of a highly distracted, highly competitive audience, which the affluent traveler is getting messages from all around the world consistently, encouraging them to travel there. Advertising can help Canada stand out. It can also allow us to target those segments by income or interest or intent, and ensuring that the dollars that we're spending in advertising reach the travelers that matter most to us. We can look at some premium ad placements, for example, looking at luxury magazines, looking at high impact digital formats. Even connected TV is starting to have some breakthrough moments against this audience. And ultimately, we can use advertising to reinforce the message that we're seeing in earned media across social content and within those peer reviews, really pushing a traveler from that initial kind of awareness, research, discovery, all the way through to that final booking. And we've included a couple of campaigns that we've seen over the last year that we wanted to give credit to. Canada is having a moment. A lot of people are turning to Canada as a potential to travel to. And there's been some really strong campaigns that have shown Canada as a premium destination. The Destination Canada campaign, Canada Naturally, that we saw a really great overview of that campaign at TIAC last week, but it's easy to find online if you want to dig into it a little bit further, showing destinations and moments across Canada from coast to coast to coast, across every corner of the country. And the second one is the Come Hug It Out campaign, really bringing forward Canadian kindness. The reason to come visit is we're welcoming. We want Americans to come here. We love each other as people, regardless of what's happening in the political sphere. So, two campaigns that are doing a fantastic job of just messaging our country to these travelers. So, with all of that, we truly believe that together these channels can create a brilliant holistic strategy that would inspire the affluent traveler, inform them of what Canada has to offer, reassure them that we're the right place to come, that it's safe, they can get everything that they want out of a trip here, and ultimately convert the high value American travelers to choose Canada. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Chris to talk about how we can actually do some of this work together.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So I think, it's interesting to look through the different channels, some of those levels, the percentages are, quite, whether it's 7% this, 10% that are quite low. Generally speaking, the affluent traveler doesn't like to say that they were influenced by anything, that they're making their own decisions. So I think you have to take those numbers with a bit of a grain of salt. The fact that they do get reported even at those levels, speaks to the importance of continuing to use those tools, because we do believe the traveler is underreporting the influence and admitting to how they discover and book travel and destinations. But ultimately, that really speaks to if they're primarily making their decisions based on past experience, really heightens the importance of destination development, and not just destination development at the broad sense of doing a tourism master plan, but actually thinking about experience strategy. We've been doing some interesting destination development work with Banff Lake Louise, looking specifically at, well, how can we create experiences that will resonate with affluent travelers? So this is really about product development targeted to specific segments. I think that's something that, all destinations, if they want to attract this audience, really need to think about. Sometimes it's just about repackaging and how we frame current experiences that already exist and targeting it for this specific type of traveler. The second thing I think is you think about destination brand, really important. We work with destinations, hotels, resorts across the U.S., Central America, Hawaii, really looking at how they position themselves to attract affluent travelers. I think in Canada, we're a little bit shy actually of using the word luxury. We don't like to think of ourselves as a luxury product, but we are attracting and we do resonate with this high value guest. So how do we think about our story? And when we talk about brand, not just logo, but actually our positioning as a destination in order to resonate with these audiences. And the last piece really is then we still absolutely need to be marketing. How we market is changing with AI, the role earned media plays, the right content. I mean, we're all preaching to the choir. Many of you here today are all destination marketers. But I'm thinking about, should you have a high value guest strategy or an affluent traveler specific strategy? We believe that the size and the growth of this particular segment, really warrants some thinking and carving that out to say, well, what is our marketing strategy for the high value guest, high value traveler, in order to think about that specific segment? And that's an area that, we can be of help as well. So to wrap up, I wanted to take some Q&A. If there's any questions, you could pop those up into the Q&A. One here we can start off with from Eugene. Said that, safety seems quite high. Has this changed? Is this a factor that puts destinations on the list or just removes destinations if they are not safe? I think that's a great question. Safety has been at the top of the list since we started doing this survey in 2008. So that's something that has not changed. And I think the way you framed your question is exactly right, that safety doesn't put destinations on the list, it removes destinations, right? So we've seen, growing examples and changes in travel behavior where the US market in particular can change on a dime based on international events and how a destination is perceived. So safety, or the fact that Canada is perceived as being quite safe, certainly is a key strength. If you have other questions, yeah, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I think another question here that's come up a lot is around, as I was just mentioning, is Canada really a luxury destination? I think the answer of that is that we have to get comfortable using that word. At TIAC last week, several conversations about affluent traveler, or we use the term high value guests. We don't use the term luxury at all. And I think that's okay. But I think if we can sort of focus on saying, well, affluent travelers, focusing on the economics of this conversation of, this is a $500 billion market. What piece of that can we get as a destination, as a hotel or a resort? And what's our strategy in order to reach them? And whether you want to call that a luxury travel strategy, you want to call that an affluent traveler strategy, or you want to call that a high value guest strategy. I think what's important is that you have a strategy, you have a positioning, and you have a experience development focused on this segment because this is where all of the growth is coming out of the US. And in fact, it's also true in Europe as well. When you look at the hotel data, as I mentioned earlier, 100% of the growth that we're seeing in revenue from an accommodation basis is in the upscale and the luxury segment. And I think this is a longer term secular trend that is really driving the market in two directions. One into the upscale and luxury is growth, and then we see growth in cruise, all inclusive, packaged holidays, et cetera, that are catering to that mid market. So for us as destinations or as a hotel or a resort, in an ideal world, you can play in both of those markets, but you might have to choose. And if you have to choose, we would advise to focus on the segment where the most revenue is, where the fastest growth is, where it really is amongst these affluent travelers. So with that, I'm not seeing any other questions, so we'll wrap up. Really thank everyone for joining us today, and please reach out to us. You can reach us through the info@resonanceco.com, or you likely already have my email on hand somewhere. You can reach me at cfair@resonanceco.com, and we'd be delighted to chat with you a little bit about your destination and where you see yourself going and how you see yourself positioned and what the opportunities might be for you from a growth perspective as it relates to increasing your share of affluent travelers as part of your particular market. So thanks again for joining us.